All right, there we go. So as I said, this is just a truncated version of what we would do with Introduction to Psychology, which will just review kind of what the definition is, what the goals we have for each is, and then we'll move on to some of the kinds, we'll brush on some of the theories and philosophies that psychology aims to work on so that we just have a kind of just a basic idea of what psychology as a science is, and then we'll move on to the subfields that we're interested in for this semester, which is cultural psychology and cross-cultural psychology. And we'll explain what the difference between those two are when we get to them. Okay, so let's jump right in. I want to start with the definition of psychology, which comes from the Greek and uh, uh, Greek language. And I'll just point out here, of course, whenever you're dealing with an ology, this means knowledge or study of. So sociology, psychology, biology are all the study of or knowledge of. Okay. Now, in psychology, the psych part comes from the word meaning mind. Okay. Mind being your mental life, if we want to put it that way. It is your experience other than what you're experiencing as kind of the physical part of your body. Okay. Now, if we literally translate psyche, though, which meant mind in Greek, it actually directly translates to the word breath, because what the Greeks believed is that when you do your first breath after coming out of mom, you breathe in your soul or you breathe in your mind, and then when you breathe your last breath, you breathe out your soul or mind. Okay, so it's very much this idea that if we're going to get to this kind of dualistic perspective on psychology, whether our body and mind are one and the same, or if they're two separate entities, this is definitely a dualistic approach in that they believed that the mind and the body are two separate entities. Okay, so that's the original definition. More of the modern definition, and then I'll go back up to the science and profession part. The modern definition is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. And I want to just focus on the three terms that are in bold. First is scientific. What we mean by scientific is we use some methodology and some process that can be understood by other psychologists so that those psychologists then can replicate our research. Okay. So when we're talking about cross-cultural psychology, and this is the best instance, right? Let's say someone is comparing um, uh, some psychological process and they're comparing Peru versus Mexico. Okay. So the researcher in Peru sets up these parameters and does this comparison between Peru and Mexico, and then maybe and they get some result, whatever it may be. I know I'm talking a little abstract here, but then let's say there's another psychologist that maybe be in Mexico, and even though there's language barriers because they both know the methods and the statistical procedures, that person in Mexico then will can try and replicate what the researcher in Peru found. And really, when we're talking about cross-cultural psychology, that is the best instance of replication when you have both cultures trying to look at the same perspective or see if there's differences based on the other culture during the research or this culture. Because we know, and this is one of the things that we'll talk about, is when doing cross-cultural comparisons, there can be a lot of bias in the research. And so, based upon the culture that the researcher was raised in or was developed in, there can be biases in cross-cultural research, and that's why using the scientific method is really important. Okay. When we talk about behavior, we're talking about overt things, and we're going to take this from the researcher's perspective. Those are all the things that, as the researcher, can directly observe. So we can directly observe, like in the example here, someone crying, someone smiling. We can observe reaction time. We can observe uh, use of language and phonemes and all of those kinds of things. Those are all things that we can directly observe as researchers. Mental processes, on the other hand, are processes that I, as the researcher, don't have direct access to. So this is could be your emotions, your thoughts, the way you interpreted a situation, all of those kind of I hate to use well, all those mental processes that I can't, as a researcher, directly observe. Okay. Now, I will say that there are a lot of advocates that say that psychology should change to the study of the brain because I mentioned the dualistic approach that started with the Greeks, where the mind and body are separate. But there's a lot of researchers who are finding that um, that there's a direct association between our mental processes and brain processes. And we'll look at this from a cross-cultural perspective to say, well, is it really the brain, or or are there other influences on our mental life? And I just noticed, Klein, you had your hand up.
Yes, on the mental process. Let's say that we're talking with an individual, and all of a sudden they just stop and they're thinking, but not sharing what they're thinking. So that would be cannot be directly observed,
Well,
the
really,
mental processes.
yeah, Klein, that's a really good example. So just when you're asking someone, so how did you experience, well, if we put it in clinical terms, right? How did you experience this session? Or let's say, what was what was your experience this last week, right? We don't have direct access to that. And so we have to go through the individual. And so that does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay. And then I just do want to go back up here that psychology is both a science and a profession. And so science meaning we do pure research on behavior and mental processes. We go and we explore reaction time to some stimulus, those kinds of things. And it's not really meant to be something that is applicable to, say, um, the professions. Now, in the profession area, and I want to emphasize this point. So, probably most individuals, when they think of psychology, you think of clinical psychology, counseling, therapists, psychotherapists, and all those kinds of that profession. It's kind of one of those things. But we also have what are called industrial organizational psychologists, which study that look at increasing efficiency in the office place, for example, and those. But I want to make a very clear point that when we're talking about a profession in psychology, we do not abandon the scientific process. Okay. So when we look at clinical psychology, this is basically the process that mimics the scientific process. Okay. A person comes in with a question, maybe a question about depression or anxiety or something like that. Okay. And then you do an assessment, which in scientific terms is doing your literature review. And so you're looking at what the individual went through and you're comparing it against what we know about that given question or about that kind of situation. Okay. And then we develop a diagnosis. In scientific terms, we call this hypotheses. Okay, it's our prediction or what we think will happen if we implement some type of experiment, in this case, some type of treatment modality. Okay, and then And then we test it, and at the end of treatment, we see if they've gotten better or if they've gotten worse. If they've gotten worse, we go right back to the question and go through the process again. If they've gotten better, we report that and we say this therapeutic modality worked for this, and but we keep the confidentiality. So we're not saying, yeah, Joe did really well with this. No, we're reporting that this modality had this effect for this individual, and we might use that again. So my point being is that even though in the you're in the profession, we still use a scientific process. In fact, when I went through my doctoral degree, it was 90 credits long. 70 of those credits were in research methods and statistics. Only the remaining 20 were in content area. Okay. So that just kind of emphasizes this relation, even though we have professions, we all use kind of the scientific process. And again, when we're looking at it from a cross-cultural perspective or a cultural psychology perspective, usually our question has to do something with culture and how it influences some mental or behavioral process. Okay. And then within this setting, we have kind of four goals to kind of achieve our ends. So the first one is that we usually start with is a description. So and in this, what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out a phenomenon that is different from any other phenomenon, and we're going to give it a label. Again, the easiest one is in the clinical setting. So you have someone who is having sleeping issues, they're having eating issues, they're having a hard time getting up to go to work. They constantly have these thoughts that they're worthless and whatnot. And we look at that and we say this is different than someone who has an anxiety or something else, and so we label this depression. When it comes to a cross-cultural perspective, the first things we need to do is provide a description of the cultures. So, for example, in cross-cultural example, we want to give a description, one, of the cultures. So it gets a little bit more complicated because we need to know and understand and define the cultures that we're comparing. And then the second part is then asking the question that we want to um, look at. So maybe we're looking at um, parenting processes. Well, let me do this one more closely related with research that I've done, and that is human sexuality and intimate relationships. Okay, so let me do a basic comparison. We'll take the indigenous Amazonian uh, individuals, and what's interesting about this culture is that it's been largely untouched by Western culture. So we're really comparing a culture that hasn't been aculturalized, or if we want to use the word colonialized. Okay. And then let's say we're going to compare sexuality and parenting and everything to the basics of Western culture here in the United States. Okay. So, and then we got to define our variables. So, in in our Western culture. So when we're talking about having children and everything, we have a father, we have a mother, and then we between those two we have a children, and that sets up the family system or a child on the most basic level. This is a very basic level, okay? In the Amazonian situation, the mother tries to decide what qualities her child wants. So let's say she wants the child to be smart, tall, and strong. Okay. So she'll go have sexual relationships with a person who is the smartest, the tallest, and the strongest in the village, because what they believe is all of those essence go into the child. Okay. And then when the child is born, all three of those men step forward as the father. So in the Amazonian, in this example, the child would have three fathers and one mother. Okay. So that's the description we have. And then we want to ask, what type of outcome, what are we looking for in the child? Maybe if you take in developmental psychology, we're trying to see what Piagetian level of development they go to. And you don't need to know about this right now. I'm just saying we're just going to measure the developmental differences cognitively. Let's just say that. Okay. So on the next one, we want to understand. Okay. We want to understand that being able to state what causes these different behaviors and these different relation setups between the Amazonian people and people here in the United States. What is it that causes these beliefs? So largely, you can go back to things like spirituality. You can go back to, you could even use evolutionary terms. You can use a lot of things to determine, what is it that what causes this. So here in Western United States, when we look at the culture of it, it goes back to the um, um, J-O Christian belief about the mother, the father, and the child, those kinds of things. In the Amazonian range, they're very, very much a spiritual um, people who want and they believe in the idea of essence and the like. So those would be both on are kind of on a spiritual level, okay? And then it becomes culturally fixated, meaning that even here in the United States, people who are not Christian still have the mother, father, child mindset on the cultural level. They don't need to have that Christian belief that that's how it should be. Okay. Now, again, these things tend to change. We could get into research dealing with, LGBTQ, all those kinds of things, but that's beyond kind of this example we're having today. So now we also have to get into the component of developmental levels, cognitive development. So we want to see if these different parenting setups predict a developmental level. Okay. And remember, developmental level is based on an average age, blah, blah, blah. And maybe what we just want to see is do they develop the same or do they develop differently? Those kinds of things. So this is the prediction part. Does that parenting system that is different between cultures creates different in developmental stages? Okay. And then, of course, this necessarily isn't something we want to do because we've already had centuries of colonization and culturation, acculturation. So when we talk about control, which is being able to predict or influence these behaviors, what we're looking at for a cultural level is what systems are in place that maintain these two different parenting aspects and therefore the cognitive development level in the United States. So here in the United States, we have laws against polygamy, right? So you can't marry more than one individual. But if you look at the Amazonian level, and I really apologize, there's a different term for females who have several husbands. But it's basically a female version of polygamy. I apologize if anyone knows the term for what would be the female version of polygamy, please drop it in the chat. I apologize for forgetting. So those would be the structural components that maintain these two different cultural ways of being. Okay. So this is what we kind of do from a cross-cultural perspective. Um, Polyandry. Thank you, Summer. Okay. So um, so that's what we would want to look at, right? And that's how we would meet these goals from a cross-cultural perspective. Okay. All right, I do want to just cover some real quick myths about psychology. Myth number one is psychology is not all about mental health. While it may appear to be, and I understand where this myth comes from, if we look at the American Psychological Association, they have 52 divisions of psychology or subdivisions of psychology. But 52% of psychologists are either in the clinical psychology or counseling psychology areas. So it's understandable where this myth comes from. And we will look at cross-cultural studies with different mental health outcomes. We'll look at things like ADHD, autism rates, and different depression rates, psychopathology. All of these, we will look at these cross-cultural comparisons and try to determine what are the cultural differences that result in these differences. Okay. Okay. All right. And again, you probably have recognized that we still look at from a cult. So I'm going to talk about these different philosophies from a cultural perspective, not necessarily a cross culture. So when we're talking about cultural psychology, we're talking about how does a given culture look at these different philosophical problems that psychology has tried to answer. And again, when we get into the what is it called, the meat of this class, we will return to these classical problems to determine. So I will actually end this part with an Otham philosophy. Now, again, there's several. This one comes from one of our instructors here at TOCC, um, to kind of see kind of how again other cultures answer some of these questions. Okay, so the first one is the nature versus nurture debate. Um, and this is basically the idea that do we develop based on experience? So, will or are we born with our personality, our intelligence level, all of those kinds of things? And probably, and again, this is a cultural view. So right now we're looking at it from the Western cultural view, and then we need to explore other cultures as we get into the course. But we can go back to again the Greeks with Plato and Aristotle. Okay, and I'm not going to get into the full Psych 101 lecture on this. Basically, what I'm going to say is Plato is going to take the nature approach, and that is who we are based on inherited traits and blood. Okay, basically, this is the precursor to the idea of how much does your genetics influence your behavior and mental processes. But from a cultural perspective, what Plato set up in here is the systems of aristocracy, okay? That kings and queens are born because they have the blood of past kings and queens. And all the way down, the farmer is a farmer because his dad and his grandfather and great grandparents were farmers. And according to Plato, because we're born into this quote unquote nature, we can't go from being a farmer to a businessman to a business owner and the like, okay? That we are in this position. So we'll look at some other cultures. For example, there's some cultures that have the warrior class, they have the leader class, and those classes are pretty much based upon what their father did. And so Western culture isn't the only one that did this. But then again, eventually, Western culture moved from this view, this Aristotelian view, to a democratic view that it's not really based on blood. So the point at this point dealing with cultures is cultures change based on the time. Okay. There was a time in Western culture where everything was based upon bloodline. And we've moved to a position where now it's based on your access to resources, the democratic process, all those kinds of things. But there's difficulties with that as well. So we'll get into that. Aristotle, on the other hand, believed in the nurture approach. He believed that who we are is based on experience. Okay. So we go into this world and we develop certain skills, we develop certain abilities, and that puts us where we are in our position in life, what we're going to do with our future, those kinds of things. So if you think about this, if you strongly believe in education, you're leaning more towards the Aristotle part of development. If you believe I am just who I am because of my family and because of that, you're leaning more towards the Plato end. If we look at it from a genetics perspective, of course, we know that this is an interaction between what we're born with and the experience in our world. We'll get a little bit into genetics and genetic comparisons as we move through the course, but and kind of why people are so interested in things like ancestry.com and understanding their past and whatnot. So we will get into that when we're talking about cultural psychology. Okay. Um, the mind body problem. So this is the idea of is the mind and body separate, as the Greeks mentioned about breathing in the soul and breathing out the soul. Or are we born with a blank slate? If we want to put it in more modern terms, a blank hard drive. Um, and then experience writes upon that. So in the first version, which is Descartes, we have a mind that acts on the body and controls the body. Okay. In Locke's term, or John Locke's term, the mind and the body are the same, and both of them rely on experience to learn and to develop. Okay. And again, I'll just go back to this, one or the other. This debate has not been settled. Even with our modern brain sciences, there's things that the brain sciences can't explain in psychological terms. Okay. And going back to cultural psychology, if we were born with the same brain, then culture wouldn't determine our behaviors and mental processes. So across the globe, we would see the same levels of mental health. We would see the same levels of disease states. We would see, but we will see that the brain doesn't always determine those things. That cultural influence does determine a lot about how the environment is acting upon the brain and the brain system. Okay. The next thing that we kind of take on is the nature versus nurture approach, and so the two people who are involved with this is Hobbes and Rousseau. Hobbes is an English um, 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 philosopher, and this is where we can get into a little bit of our cross-cultural examples here. And Hobbes is going to have a huge influence on Western government and what Western government is meant to do for the people and what is not meant to do. Oh, Kathleen, you have your hand up.
Yeah. So going back to which it just before I forget. So
Yeah.
if somebody's grandmother has like bipolar and manic depression and the mom has it and then the daughter has it, is that passed down or
Well,
is that
that's
back to like the genetics of everything to where um or is that like the where it's like culture,
well,
their environment?
well, I think okay, your question is completely valid, and I want to try and put this in clear terms. So, when it comes to disorders, psychological disorders, we use a ratio of or what we call the genetic quotient. Okay. What this quotient tells us using the tools we have today, which aren't very good, about what percentage of a given thing is based upon genetics, so inheritance, versus experience. Okay. And so when we're talking about mental disorders, there's a lot of variability in this. Okay. But when it comes to things like bipolar and to schizophrenia, those have a high genetic quotient. We're talking 80, 90%. In fact, there's a famous psychologist, again, I'm having trouble with names. Um, he always has a group of graduate students, and he asks his graduate students, how can you be sure that you're diagnosing someone with schizophrenia correctly? And of course, they go through all the assessment tools, all the, you do some observation, those kinds of things. And he said, no. You simply ask him if he has a brother or sister who also has schizophrenia or has those same symptoms. And that's the best way to be sure, for example, with schizophrenia, that you got the diagnosis correct. Bipolar is very much like schizophrenia. It's very genetically viable. It has a very high genetic quotient. However, when we look at other disorders, I can think of ADHD has about a 50%, depression and anxiety have about a 20%. They're more of a combination between the environment and genetics. Okay. Now, because we can elaborate on this, and it's a very good question. Well, what about cross-cultural things? So, if you lived through my Psych 101 class, we talked about the difference between ADHD rates in France and ADHD rates here in the United States. And there's a lot of individuals who argue that ADHD is an organic disorder. Okay. And that's our Western United States comprehension of ADHD. Now, why am I talking about Western? Why am I talking about United States versus France? Because France has a very, very similar education system than here in the United States. And where is the majority of ADHD diagnosed? It's diagnosed in the classroom with teachers. Okay. But when we look at ADHD rates, the United States, I believe, has about a 13% diagnosis rate, where in France, they have less than 1% diagnosis rate. Okay. But the difference is here in the United States, we heavily rely on the medical model. So we instantly put the children on medications. We put the children maybe through some behavioral therapy. Very few get it, but that's the best combination. In France, when they have a child who is inattentive, um, um, very agitating and everything, they actually go and work with the parents first. They look at the parenting system and they work with the parents about setting up consistency for the child's environment, setting up these different things. So they take, instead of a medical model approach, they take a family systems approach. And in using that in at least their country, then that children are only diagnosed after the family systems thing hasn't worked and their diagnosis rates are less than 1%. Okay. And so even though we can say here in the United States, we make this claim that ADHD is very inheritable, it's genetic, it's biological, other cultures who don't think it's biological have a different way and a different approach of treating it. And that accounts for the different diagnosis rates between, like, for example, here in the United States and there in France. I know that might have been a complicated answer, but did that enlighten what you were trying to ask?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So on to the nature nurture. No, the nature of man, nature of people debate. I should change that. Hobbes and Rousseau, and like I said, Hobbes is going to have a huge influence, and I'll end with this one today. Hobbes and Rousseau are going to take the same approach to understand what if we're naturally born kind of evil or bad or naturally born good. Okay. They're both going to look at nature, and Hobbes is going to look at nature and they're going to see it's a chaotic, destructive, evil place. And therefore, he's going to say that the natural state of man is evil. Rousseau is going to look at it different. He's going to look at nature and he's going to look at symmetry. He's going to see that, everything is a cycle of life. The volcanoes, while they look violent, create more land. The predator and prey have a symbiotic relationship. The predator eats the prey. The predator then defecates and makes growth for plants for the prey to eat. So he's going to see this kind of symmetry and beauty basically in life, and that even things that look destructive have a good purpose. And so he's going to conclude that the nature of humans is good, and that when you see bad things in humans, it's because they're deviating from nature. And that's what creates the evils of the world, is when we deviate from nature. Okay, this is going to have a huge influence. Rousseau's in things like Greenland, the Netherlands, Norway, and their governmental systems. Because from Hobbes' theory, what especially the United States and England is going to do is it's going to say, if we're born evil, the purpose of government is to control the people to continue on the species. So everything is going to be controlled by the government. We're going to have laws that regulate behaviors. We're going to have laws that regulate conduct and commerce and all of those kinds of things. And our legal system is going to be a punishment system. It's going to be an isolationist system. Okay. Um, and Rousseau's, however, they're going to say, well, if someone is doing something bad, they're deviating from their nature. And so, what the purpose of government, what the purpose of the correction system is to bring those individuals back to nature. Okay. And so I'm going to leave you with this question that I want everyone to think about for this next Wednesday. Here in the United States, we use a punishment system based on Hobbes' theory. Okay. They're evil, so we got to beat the evil out of them. So we isolate them. We basically use a punishment type system. Now, this is changing. I know I probably have some correction people in here that are saying, well, we're changing, but that's the basic system. In Norway and the Netherlands, going to jail is almost like going to a spa. It's very comfortable. They eat very good food. They're allowed to be outside. And the idea is that you're trying to bring them back to nature, back to their natural state. Okay. And so this is where I'm going to leave you with the question to think about today. Here in the United States, the recidivism rate, that's the probability of someone ending up back in prison after their first conviction, is 60%, meaning that 60% of offenders who go to prison will end up back into prison. Okay. In Norway, Netherlands, those areas, their recidivism rate is, oh gosh, the statistic just left my mind. Their recidivism rate is less than 15%. Okay. And a lot of students go, wow, but they're treated so well. Wouldn't you just continue to do those crimes? No, they don't, because they have a different cultural view. Over there, they help fix people. They bring them back to who they should be closest to their nature. Where here in the United States, we separate, we correct, we punish. So I want you to think about that as we move along in the class. And I bear to ask this question. Is that culture, or is that some other feature of the human condition between two different mindsets? So I want you to think about that question. And I'm going to end right here because we are out of